Hello everyone, it's Elizabeth from the Smart Stitcher. In this week's video we are showing you how to add a rubber sole to your moccasin, and that's how to add it to your pattern pieces through to how to add it on when you're actually ready to glue it. We're showing you how to mark out your leather, and we're also showing you how to prepare your fur for trimming and sewing. So let's get into it. As I'm adding a rubber sole to my moccasin, I am going to be creating some slots on my sole template so that I can get my rubber sole lined up properly and in the correct position. Where I've drawn on the sort of center lines for my pattern, I'm going to line those up with my sole, so making sure that the ones on the rubber sole are lined up with the ones on the actual sole, and then I am going to draw around my template. I'm just going to use some weight to help me be doubly certain I've put it in the right position, and then keeping my pencil upright I'm going to go all the way around and just draw on my template, so I know that when I'm gluing that this is the area that I'm going to be gluing. But one thing I've got to be doubly sure of is where my glue line will stop, and I'm just going to create some slots now which I'm going to show you, and these are going to be really useful when it comes to helping me mark on where my rubber outer sole will sit, but also it will really help me when I'm gluing. So I'm going to show you what they look like now. So when I come to cut out my slots, I'm keeping the line that I've just drawn as it is. I'm not making any changes, and it's it's just enough to get a pen width through the hole. So I'm going to mark these out all the way around, and I'll probably, where there's a curve, I'll probably make them just a little bit shorter so that I can get around the curve nice and smoothly. So I've marked out all of my slots, going around the heel, coming back up to the other side, and we're now ready to cut them out. When I'm cutting these slots out, the outline I drew of where the rubber sole is going to sit is the one that has to stay in really good sort of cutting and really straight cutting. So this outer line is the one that has to stay nice and straight and really tight to that line. But if I happen to wobble when I'm cutting the inside one, I'm not going to worry too much about that, as long as I know that my outer line is straight. Now I'm going to use a scalpel to cut these out. Please make sure that you're happy using your scalpel, you've got a fresh blade, and you're not going to be cutting towards yourself or cutting your fingers in any shape or form. So to cut our slots out, and I'm going to work my way around, all the way around the template doing this, I'm going to start off by cutting the longer lines, and I'm really taking note of where my outside line is and following it really carefully, drawing my scalpel along. I'm then going to cut the inside long line, and again, if that wobbles, don't worry, it's the outer one that we want to keep nice and straight. And then I'm going to just literally cut across, so I'm actually cutting from my outside line into my pattern piece, because one of the things I don't want to do is to cut over going in the wrong direction there, because that then runs the risk of me sort of opening up and getting my pen marks in the wrong place when I'm positioning my sole. So that's all I'm going to do now. It's going to work my way along, cutting the long lines first and then cutting across, but always making sure that when I cut the short ends I am cutting from that outside line in, so that I avoid getting overcutting on into my sole, which I don't want to do. Now for this particular project I am going to be using a double-faced sheepskin, and it's got a sort of suede reverse, which is going to be my outside, and then on the inside I've got a lovely sort of sheepskin, kind of quite a nice pile. I'm going to be cutting out so that when I put my foot in, my foot is sort of running with the smoothness of the pile, so that my foot will be smooth when I put the moccasin on. And as a sort of a little bit of a guide here, we've got my little diagram. When I'm laying everything out, I am going to be making sure that my sort of head and tail are clear, and I've got a photo that I'll add in of the fleece to sort of show that to you. When I'm cutting out my pattern pieces, I want to be making sure that the stretch is going across the foot, because that's going to be quite important when we're putting sort of a shoe on or any kind of moccasin on. And it's the same for the upper, that in effect we want the stretch following our horizontal line here. Something else to add to that is the direction of the pile. Now, you can't always guarantee that it's going to be smooth. If you laid your fleece out with the head here and the tail here, that it would be smooth going that way. Sometimes you may find, based on how it's been tanned and anything else that's happened to it, that you've actually got to have it the other way around, so that you might find that you're heading towards the tail to get the smoothness of the pile, and that's absolutely fine as well. So, you know, it could be that this is reversed based on what you observe on your observations of the pile itself. For the sheepskin that I'm using here, I've actually had to sort of turn mine round, so my tail is at the head of my table up here, my head is this way round, because as I am sliding my hand along, it is going really smoothly sort of down towards the tail. So that's the direction in which I am going to be cutting. In many ways it's a bit like if you're running your hand down the animal. If you can imagine, you know, you're running from head to tail, it's usually smooth. In preparing for this video, I've noticed there was a couple of differences with a couple of other fleeces, so with everything, just always check that direction, and then you won't go wrong with your pattern pieces. The next thing to do is to check your fleece quite carefully, because there might be some areas where, say, the fleece isn't as thick, or it's just slightly thinner on the edge. You don't necessarily want that in your pattern, although if you do, of course, put it in. And we've also got to make sure that we get pieces out. So we're going to be cutting one each of this one of this one facing this way. We then turn them over to get the other foot. So in effect we'll have two uppers with one reversed and two soles with one reversed to get the left and right. So now I'm just going to finish my checks, and then I'm going to get everything ready to move on. So I've got a little bit down here off to my sort of bottom left, and that will be a place where I think, okay, I can't get an upper out of this piece, but I can get one of my sole pieces. So I'll be able to get my sole piece out of that part, and it's a bit like sort of putting together a bit of a jigsaw really. So I can then look at the other side, and there's a longer piece sort of coming off here, so I know that I'll be able to draw around that, and then I will have enough space sort of above them to be able to get my uppers out as well. And sometimes when you're sort of drawing, you might find that you're just doing a little bit of wiggling to get everything in. You just need to be able to get the blade of your scissors and your pen between your pieces. So let me show you what that looks like. So if I was going to lay these on here, I can lay them quite close to each other, still following the stretch and going across the animal, but as long as I can just get enough of my blade to cut the pieces, then they can be quite close together. Now, before I draw anything on, I've actually just been sat here kind of moving my fleece about, moving my pattern pieces about, just laying them on to get a really sort of good idea about where I've got space, and also where the sort of the thinner areas of the fleece are. So something else to watch as well is the edges, because they're sort of a little bit uneven. You can sometimes feel that they might have a little bit of sort of mud still in them, or there might just be some weak areas where you wouldn't necessarily want to place your pattern pieces. You want to place your pattern pieces on the best sort of part of the leather that you can, avoiding any holes. So I wouldn't want to put my pieces over that one. That might be fun to use for something else, but for making a moccasin slipper, there'd be nothing more irritating than getting your fingers jammed in a hole. So I'm just going to take a moment to sort of place everything, make sure I'm happy that I get the most out of my leather. So I've done my checks, and I'm happy with the position of everything, and I'm now going to start to draw on. I'm using a silver pen, but you can use a felt tip. It's basically anything you can see that's going to give you a mark on the leather, so enough that you can see it to cut it out. So the first thing I'm going to do is to draw all the way around my outline. I'm keeping my pen as upright as I can, and I'm just drawing it around the pattern piece. I'm just checking as well that it is coming out, because there's nothing worse than thinking you've drawn it and you've moved it. Before I am going to take my weights off, I'm going to draw in these slots because these are going to be where we're going to stick our sole. If you're not sticking a sole on, then obviously skip forward to the next bit. So I'm just literally putting my pen in and I'm following the outer line. So I'm putting the pressure on the sort of the outside line of my slot that I've made, because that's the true one in terms of our sort of placement, and these are going to help us get our sole, our rubber sole, in the right place, because we'll know to glue up to the outside of this line. So I've drawn everything in. I'm just doing a little check just to make sure that there's a good line that I can see. Any bits that look a bit weak, I'm going to just draw them in before I remove the template, and then weights to one side, template off, and I've got a really nice area now so that I know when I come to cut out, that's nice and clear. And basically what I'm going to do is just repeat the process now for the remaining pattern pieces, remembering to reverse them. So I've got one right cut out, I'm then going to cut out a left with it facing the other way, and the same with the upper. Right, we are all drawn on and ready to start thinking about cutting out. The last little bit of information I've added is I've added some marks so I know where to cut up through my upper. So I've just punched those with my awl, pressed them through, and then I've marked them just with my pen so I know that when I'm cutting I will follow that line, which I could probably mark with a ruler and a pen if I wanted to as well. I've also transferred the markings we added in our pattern making just to sort of let me know where the curve is going to start, and before I cut out I'm also just going to transfer the center line and these side lines as well, because that just helps me to line things up too. So I'm going to make sure all of them are on and nice and clear for me to see. I'm adding them just literally onto the kind of outline itself so that it can be seen and it'll be stitched in. So I'm not making a massive line, it's just a little kind of pen mark, so as a little guide to help me. So I'm going to do all of my holes where the curve starts. I'm going to add in the horizontal line and the vertical line as well, because that will just help line everything up when we put things together. Now, because we are cutting out a fleece and we've got a pile to work with, we've got to try and sort of minimize any damage we do to that pile. However, we've also got to cut out our leather successfully, so we've also got to kind of balance those two things out. Now, when we're cutting, we need to just be able to cut through the sort of the skin itself, and because the hair will then sort of separate. So a couple of things to suggest here. Some of you may find it easier to use a scalpel on your straight lines. Some of you may find it easier to use scissors, and this is where I would always advise having a little bit of a practice first. So you want to get yourself a really good start point, and what I'm going to do is make sure that I've got a new blade in my scalpel, so if at any point your blade feels like it's dragging or it's not cutting cleanly, then you need to change it. I'm going to start off just by making an insertion into the skin, and I'm just going to very carefully keep my hand in the same position, move my arm along following that line. And I've actually not gone that deep into the leather, so I'm probably about 4 or 5 mils into the leather itself, and I've got a really good cut of my leather. So I'm just going to very carefully keep moving my skin around so that I can draw it along and get a nice clean cut. When I get up to the curve here, I may find that I've got to change to scissors to get around the curve, just to give me a better quality of cut. But I would always recommend, if you've got little offcuts and bits of leather, just have a go and see what works for you in terms of being able to get a good shape and also to get a good clean cut on what you're doing. When it comes to cutting out the sole pieces, I'm actually going to start my cutting on the inside on a straight section and just work my way around. I've been able to cut most of my curves today with a knife, but if that's tricky for you, then just cut the curves with scissors. It's about that balance I mentioned earlier of getting a good shape but also cutting around it safely. When I start cutting, I like to keep my other hand away from the blade, and sometimes just having that sat on the leather helping to keep it stable, so my fingers on my left hand are helping to keep that stable, and then I can just move my hand down so that I'm always got my fingers out of the way of my blade, and I'm not having to go in very far. You can see that I can just get enough of a cut there. So the next thing to do is to cut out our sole pieces, and I'm using a very sort of fine, almost sort of 3-4 mils if that, piece of rubber. It's got a slightly textured surface on one side and it's smooth on the back. And what I want to do is make sure that I cut out, much the same as we've just done, a left and a right. Now there's no necessary sort of grain on this, so I'm just going to place them on so I can get maximum sort of use out of the leather. And I'm going to just draw around. I might put my weights on as well. There we go. So I'm just going to check that my pen works. And again, you might find that you've got to use maybe a different type of pen here. So let's see if I've switched to a biro. Lovely and clear. So I'm going to just draw all the way around and then flip the template over and do the second one. Right, my soles are completely drawn on and they are now ready for cutting out. I'm going to be using a scalpel to cut mine out, but again, it's going to, what you use is going to depend on the type of rubber that you've got, and always do a little test before you commit to cutting anything out. So I'm going to just line up, I'm going to follow sort of the outside of my pen line, and I'm going to get both of mine cut out ready for gluing. So now everything's cut out, my soles are ready to go. I'm just placing them on, so I've got the textured side facing outwards. I'm just sort of having a little check by eye to see how they sit in relation to my guidelines underneath, and I have to say they're looking pretty good at the moment. Now I'm going to be using a contact adhesive to attach my soles to my moccasin sort of sole. This is the one that I'm actually going to be using. You want a strong glue. Anything that is used in shoemaking will be good. You don't want anything that, if it dries hard and cracks when you flex it, that won't be a good one to use, so you may need to do a little bit of a test first. Now with the contact adhesive, we're actually going to do both surfaces of the leather, and I'm going to leave it to dry, which sounds a little bit strange, but one of the things that I found with contact adhesives, and as I've learned from people as I've gone along, is that I'm going to do a couple of layers, allow them to dry, and then I'm going to use a heat gun on one sort of side at a time, if you like, to reactivate the glue on both sides and then stick them together and leave them to properly set. Obviously, when you are using your glue, please make sure you're following the manufacturer's instructions really carefully, especially when it comes to any ventilation and any health and safety that you need to be aware of. When we are gluing our soles, we need to make sure that the glue comes right over and right up to that edge, particularly around the sole, and it's exactly the same on the sort of the moccasin piece as well. So you want to make sure that when you are gluing, your glue is right up to the line and right over the edge of your rubber sole as well. So don't sort of stop your gluing here. Make sure that if anything, you're almost very slightly over the line, because we want to get a really good stick when we actually apply the rubber to the leather. It can be quite useful to have some strips of card or old bank cards and things handy, because that can allow you to sort of really push the glue right out to the edges. And I find sort of starting from the center and working out gives me quite a good way of actually making sure that I cover my edges, and it's the same for the leather ones as well, although sometimes the little strips are handier to be able to get the glue out to the edges. So I've got my sole of my right foot and the rubber outer sole covered in my adhesive. As I start to look, now you'll notice that the adhesive actually forms quite a shiny layer, and it's allowing me, I can sort of just look in and I can see almost areas along the edge where I might want to just sort of go back in and add a little bit more glue. So if I hold that up, if you can see just along here, my edge isn't perhaps as well covered in glue as I'd like it to be, so I know that I can go back and just check all of my edges, and I can see a little bit down this side as well where there isn't perhaps as much coverage, so I can go back once the glue has had its kind of first curing period, and I can then just add in those layers as well. And I can do the same for the sole, and I must say this is where it helps to have an older cutting mat, one that you don't mind getting glue on. And I can see there's a few areas just where it's a little bit poorer in terms of my coverage, so when I do the next layer of glue I know that I can go back in and improve on that. So I'm now going to get the second one ready and have a look again at the first one afterwards. So all the gluing is now done with that first round, and the glue I've just done on the left foot here is quite shiny. Now when we come to heat it up again, it's actually going to look a little bit as shiny as this, which is what we want when we're getting ready to glue the two pieces together. So that sort of sheen that you can see on the glue at the moment as it's having its first cure is what we want when we use the heat gun to heat it up. One thing that can be really useful, particularly if you do something like that, is to have a piece of rubber on standby. And the crepe rubber I've got here, it's like would be crepe soling, but it will actually rub off most of the glue from your mat and sort of prevent sort of further damage to the mat. It will, I hope, also rub off some of the glue that I've now managed to get on my sole here. So fortunately I've been able to now remove that glue. When you are using something like a crepe rubber, always start very, very gently. Don't be tempted to sort of go in and really do a lot of pressure, because you can end up sort of damaging the leather with the crepe. So just be really light to start with and sort of gradually build up your pressure. But fortunately for me, that bit has come off. So I'm now going to go back in for my second layer. The glue it's almost sort of tacky, but it's fairly dry. That one's got a bit more drying to do. This one feels very, very slightly tacky, but there isn't much kind of coming off, if anything, on my fingers. So I'm now going to go back in. I'm going to pay particular attention to the areas where the glue didn't get quite as good coverage to start with, and we can almost sort of see there's some sort of brush marks there, but I'm going to make sure this time that I don't let anything fold over on itself. A little tip when you are sort of gluing some of your areas is just using a little cocktail stick. Now if you need to hold somewhere down, and it's often, for me, it's the last bit where I've been holding a finger down here, I've glued everywhere else, but now I need to glue this. So I'm using a cocktail stick just to keep the sole rubber stable and stop it from shifting about, to enable me then to be able to come down and make sure that I've got everywhere. So I'm not piercing the rubber with the cocktail stick, it's just there, and it's not going to cause enough of a problem for any sort of gluing to be affected. It just enables me to stabilize what I'm doing while I'm making sure that I've got coverage with my glue, and it works certainly for both soles, so I can just use that. And you can also use it on the leather, but again, just be careful that you're not actually pushing it through to create a hole. We have now completed our second round of gluing, and where the skin is a little bit wrinkly just on the sole of my right foot here, I've just sort of lifted it up and just moving it about just to check that I've got coverage of glue within any sort of dips or wrinkles of the skin, and I think I'm pretty happy with that actually. So just do a final check all of your edges, check your heel and toe areas, make sure that things aren't sticking together, and then we're going to leave those now so that they go off, and when I come back to them I shouldn't have any sort of tackiness whatsoever. It should be that I can just touch them and they don't feel tacky at all, and that will mean that they are ready to be heated up and then glued together. You can even sort of leave this 24 hours, 48 hours or longer, because you're going to heat activate the glue. So if you were you had to go away for a few days, you could just sort of get them to this stage, leave them, and then come back and heat activate the glue and stick them together. 48 hours later, my glue has completely kind of cured off. There's no sort of stickiness to it. It is still a little bit shiny, and that's absolutely fine. And now we are going to be getting ready to heat activate it and stick the soles together. Please make sure that you're doing this in a well ventilated room. You'll notice that I've changed cutting mats completely. I've got a really old one that I use when I'm sort of using the heat gun so that can kind of happily get damaged, and I keep my nice mats for other work. So what we're going to do now is use the heat gun. Make sure you're in a well ventilated room. Make sure that you are also following the instructions on how to use your heat gun nice and safely. I'm going to start off just by putting one sole and one moccasin base to one side, and I'm going to heat each of these pieces, and I want the glue to almost look like it's sort of like it was when I first put it on. So it's still shiny now, but it's going to look even perhaps a little bit more sort of almost liquidy, but not kind of running and moving about. Once I've got both of them to that particular point, I'm then going to very, very carefully, and this is where you must just take your time, line up with your pen marks, and gently and very, very carefully lower your sole into position so that you are following the marks that you have made where the actual rubber will be positioned. So this is about sort of just taking your time, making sure that you're happy that everything is heated up, and it will feel slightly tacky, and then when you come to put both pieces together, line them up, go down very, very carefully, and I tend to sort of put a few weights on once I have applied them both together, just to allow them to cure and to set. So let's get underway. So our soles are stuck on, and as I sort of look round, there aren't any sort of gaps where this sole is coming up. So always sort of double check to make sure that your soles are completely sort of stuck down, and if they're not, then you're going to have to re-glue. Once I've done the next bit of trimming, I'm actually going to weight mine so they have a chance to sort of properly go off and sort of cure and set before I start wearing them. And I definitely wouldn't start sort of making them and wearing them on the same day, so just give them a little bit of a chance to sort of set and to dry. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to, where our seams are going to be, is we're going to just trim off some of this excess fur around the edge to make it slightly easier to sew. To do that, I'm going to take my sort of leather scissors, and I am just looking to really sort of trim almost at sort of 45 degrees. I find it easier to do it from the back and from the sort of sole side, and I'm just going to trim off some of the fur to make stitching our seams a little bit easier. So in a way, I'm just sort of taking away some of the bulk of the fur by the edge and just sort of giving it a little trim to just make our stitching a little bit easier. So I'm going to go and do that all the way around both of the sole pieces. It does get a little fluffy, so you may wish to do this outside, and we're just removing the bulk on both of these sole pieces. So once we've trimmed both our soles, we're actually going to trim in a similar way the outside of our moccasin. So what we're actually going to do, it's this sort of U shape. So it's going to come up around the toes and back down the other side. We are not trimming the back seam because we're doing something slightly different with the back seam. So this seam at the base we're not trimming, whereas we're going to start and go all the way around that U shape in exactly the same way, just sort of trimming that fur off at 45 degrees and just removing a little bit of bulk from the edge. So that's the next thing to do on both of your uppers. The final thing to do is to open up our uppers. Now we've already marked on our points where we're going to be opening them, and I'm just going to start here, and I'm going to just use a ruler to help me, and I've got a fresh blade in my scalpel, and I'm just drawing the blade through the skin that we've got here. So we're just literally just sort of cutting really, really carefully in and and along. There's one, and we repeat on the other side. Before I started to cut the centre lines down, I actually drew them in for the purposes of the video. You don't have to draw them in unless it particularly helps you, but it's just to sort of show you where we were trimming. If you kind of have a bit of a wobble as you are trimming, then you can always sort of come back in with a pair of scissors and just sort of even up any edges. But we're not cutting any sort of trimming anything off this back edge, and we're not trimming anything off the edge that we've just opened up either, so don't cut anything extra off of them.